Hey folks, I'm Chuck Black. We're doing 52 weeks of Python in 10-minute or less sessions. The topic for this week is going to be functions in Python. And I put this stuff up here just to remind you, if you keep going with the class, then you too will be able to create software that does stuff like this. So what is a function? A function is a piece of code that you define somewhere and then you call it from, say, your main line or from another piece of code. What happens when Python is executing your code? When it comes to the reference to the function here, it's going to call into that function, execute everything. If there's a return value, then you can assign the return value to your variable here, and then the program continues on. Now, why do you define functions? Number one reason is to keep things organized and easy to read. So if you like things to be disorganized and messy and ugly and nobody can read it, then don't use functions. But if you enjoy organization and you want to make your code readable, then you definitely need to do functions. Number two reason why you do functions is so that you can have code reuse. In other words, if I create something called create devices, so I defined this function, create devices, it may be useful to me in my program. It may be useful elsewhere as well. So in other parts of my code, or even I could share this code with others and people could call my function, and then this code gets reused and we don't have to duplicate it over and over again. So that's in general what a function is and why we use them. So let me highlight something here. I've actually cheated in what you're looking at, and if you have an eagle eye, you may have looked at this and said, wait a minute, you defined the name of the function and the parameters, but you didn't define the function itself. Well, yes, I did. There's a couple ways we can see the code that's in the function. Notice I clicked on this little thing on the left in PyCharm, and allows me, in a normal situation, here is my function. You can see there's a whole lot of stuff in there. This is what we were looking at before, so that's exactly the same. But this thing I hid by clicking right here. So that allowed us to see what actually was going on with this function call. I can also go over to this ellipsis, these three dots, and PyCharm will pop it open and I can see the actual definition of the function if I want to. Now, normally when you're writing the code, it's going to look like this, and that's just the normal way that you would end up looking at code. But I made it easier for a simple introduction by doing that. So don't be confused by that. There's a lot of code in there. Let me point out one other thing. What you see here, this create devices, where I'm passing in how many devices do I want and how many subnets do I want. There's a lot of code in here that does this. It's got if statements, which we've seen. It's got for loops. Oh, look, it's got a for loop with another for loop inside it. So I'm going to go through here. Look at all this random stuff. I got all the random stuff going on again. And I've got my IP address. And I'm going to end up creating these devices and returning all of these devices. And you can see that they are, when I print them, that's what this is going to look like. Now, I don't really care, and I'm not going to go through the details of this right now because I want to explain to you how functions work in Python. If you want more detail, you can always consult the longer version of this in the 52 weeks of Python. So a couple of things that are really important to know about functions in Python and in other programming languages. You will have parameters. These are things that get passed into the function and are then used within the function. Here is where I call the function, and this is the name of these parameters as they are received. The second thing, and I need to open this up in order for us to see it, is there will quite often be return values. In Python, you can return a single value. It can be multiple values. It can be nested data structures. It can be all of those things. So parameters and return values are important to know and understand. So let's look at these up here, these parameters that are defined with default values. That means that if I were to call this function and not pass anything in whatsoever, then the number of devices and the number of subnets would be 1. And if I were to read this, then here you can see I have one subnet and I have one value. If I wanted to change this to say that there were 5 different devices and I were to run it, then you would see that I have 5 different devices. These are the default values. You will get confused between what you see there and what you end up seeing down here when they're passed in. Down here, these are called keyword values. That means passing by keyword. Do you notice that I have num subnets, and that's the first thing here, and num devices is the second thing. But up here, num devices is 1, num subnets is 2. Python is smart enough to know when I specify num subnets equals 5, then it's going to attach it to this num subnets. These are keywords and are very important. Num devices of 4 is going to go with that num devices. So if I pass them by keyword, then that's what that means. Now, if I were to get rid of these keywords and do something that looks like this, then what's going to happen is this is called positional passing of parameters. That means the position is altogether super important. That what will happen is 5 will be assigned within this function to num devices, and 4 will be assigned to num subnets. And what does that mean? If we were to look at this code, what is happening in this code? We're doing some error checking here. We're going to go for subnets up to num subnets, and our device that we're going to create, manufacture, is going to go up to the number of devices. So that's what we're using them for. But very important to know the 2 different ways to pass things in. One way is via position, the position of these things. And the other way, as we saw when it was originally set up, is by keyword. And if you do it by keyword, then you can put them in any order that you want. And you just specify the keyword, an equal sign, and then the value. So looking a little bit closer at what we've created, number of subnets 5, number of devices 4. And so if we look over here at the IP addresses, you can see 10.0.1, that subnet has 4 devices. 10.0.2. whatever, that has 4 devices also. Now if I was to change this to say like number of device subnets was 1 and the number of devices was, let's say, 15, what would this look like? Well, when I go ahead and run that, what I'm going to see is everything is in 10.0.1. whatever, and I can see I have devices from 1 to 15. So that's how this function works. Again, I'm not going into the details of this. You can look it up elsewhere, but that is basically what we're doing here. Okay, one thing I want to take a small moment to reiterate here. I have everything expanded kind of like normal. Here's my main piece of the program, and then here is my function that I have, and that is indentation. Code blocks are important, and the indentation, you must adhere to the appropriate indentation. You can do any number of characters that you want, but you need to be consistent. So indentation is critical for Python to understand this. The second thing I want to point out is this. You're going to see this a lot. This is how we tend to structure our main applications. It just helps down the road. You'll understand this more a little bit later, but basically if this is my main application, in other words, if I'm just running it, then it's going to come in here and do this. And so that is what this is all about. No need to worry about the details for now. So this is the main stuff that gets executed. This is my function that gets called by this call right here. And these are the parameters that get passed and gets executed, and then we print it out. All right, so what did we talk about? We talked about defining functions. We used the def keyword, and then we define the function, and this is what this function actually looks like. We call functions in our main code or from wherever we're going to call it. We pass in parameters. In this case, I'm using keywords to pass them in. Up here where I define the function, these are default values in case nothing is passed in. Why do we do functions? We do them for a couple of reasons. One is to organize our code so that it's nice and understandable and tidy. Another reason is so that we can reuse it. We will really reuse it when we begin to do modules, which is what we're going to talk about next. So thanks for listening. Hopefully this made sense to you. Remember to write this code. You can just copy all the insides of this if you want to, or you can spend time to understand it. But I do want you to understand about passing parameters, defining functions, default values, and the like. Thank you so much for listening.